So after dispatching that cheater in the last episode, I'm now back with the white pieces, and I decided to switch things up and go for the Nimzo Larsen attack with b3. And my opponent copied me with b6, and we entered kind of a copycat system where we both have a fianchettoed bishop on the queen side, both have a pawn on d4 and d5, and now at this point, we reach this position where it kind of transposed into a Kali-Zukertort system, which is when you have these kind of pawns here, when you have a bishop here, and this fianchettoed bishop on b2, which is a system that I've seen before and I've actually been wanting to study it, but I wasn't really sure what to do when we got to this point. And I actually sat and thought about my move for almost 7 minutes, which in a rapid game where you only have 15 minutes to begin with is a very long time, even with the 10 seconds increment. I was conflicted between a couple plans. Well, the safe option would have been to just castle, and then my opponent could just play knight d7, in which you would have a symmetrical position in which it's kind of hard to get an edge. You might want to just expand on the queen side or maybe get the knight in the center. Another thing I could have done was play c4 first, and then maybe get the queen here and try to attack this way. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be a little bit more aggressive, so I decided on queen e2 with the idea to maybe open up with e4, but my opponent almost instantly countered with knight e4. And now the problem is I can't take the knight because then my opponent takes and it's a fork between the bishop and the knight. And I also don't want to take with the bishop and give it up. So I decided to play another interesting move, g4, because I realized that my opponent wants to, if I do something like castle, they want to play f5 and really cement their knight here. It would be very difficult to play on here because I have to maneuver around my opponent's control of the center. So instead I played g4, which discourages f5 because now I would take, and after pawn takes, I would have this move rook to g1. And now my rook is lined up against black's king. Pretty intimidating if you're playing black here. So instead my opponent played c5, counterattacking in the center. And now my plan here is to continue my kingside attack, but I can't leave the king in the center. So I want to castle queenside. But before I do that, I actually played the move pawn to a3, which looks strange, but what I saw was if I castled here immediately, my opponent could take on d4, and after pawn takes, bring in the bishop and exploit this weak c3 square, maybe put a knight here. It would be really annoying for me. So essentially, I eliminated the possibility of them landing a piece on b4, whether it be the bishop or the knight. And my opponent played knight to d7, just developing. And here I made a little bit of a poor decision. I had significantly less time than my opponent. What I could have just done was castle long, but I decided to take the knight. And my opponent, of course, recaptured with the pawn. And now I played knight to e5, and my opponent actually missed a trick here. They played knight takes e5, but what they should have done was take on d4, and after pawn takes, they would have had this move e3, a surprise attack against the rook, and also attacking my knight. I would have had to move my knight out of the way, but now pawn takes here, and looks not too good for me. After queen takes, they can take here, and then play queen d5, and they have this incredibly powerful attack lined up against the knight. But of course, this is something that's not easy to see if you're not expecting it, so fortunately for me, they just took the knight, and I recaptured. Here my opponent made their first significant inaccuracy. A good move here would just be to maybe move the queen to c7, prepare a rook lift. Instead, they played bishop to h4, which seems like a threatening move because it's lining up against the king, preventing the pawn from pushing, but I was going to castle long anyway, so this really doesn't prevent me from doing anything. And now the bishop is just kind of stranded on h4, and after queen c7, I took advantage of this by playing g5, a pawn sacrifice, and now my opponent correctly took the pawn because if they went around and just play a move like rook to d8, I can come in with queen g4, and after they take my pawn, their bishop is now officially trapped. So instead they took the pawn, but now this opens the g file for my rook, and I actually moved my queen in first, and after bishop h6, brought the rook in, and after g6, I'm able to capture on e4 with the knight because I have the queen support. And now the knight is threatening to infiltrate this f6 square, would be very annoying for my opponent, so he took the knight, I recaptured, Now I have a bit of an advantage because my rook is on this open file, targeting the king, and I also have a bit more space. So my opponent just played bishop to g7, looking to get their bishop onto a more useful spot. And after h4, looking to storm the king side, he just played h5. And now I jumped on the opportunity to get into his position by playing rook to d6. So of course the pawn is supporting the rook, can't take it, and I'm threatening to double up, so he has to act fast. He played rook to d8, looking to trade, but I just supported my rook with my second rook. And after a rook trade, if I were to take with the rook, then he could play rook to d8, and we would almost definitely trade, and he would have pretty good drawing chances. Instead, I took with the pawn. And now attacking the queen, of course he can take here first, and he did. And after king takes, queen to d7, putting the queen in front of the pawn. But already my advantage is building here because this pawn is only 2 squares away from queening, and my queen is very well placed. His dark squares are all weak. Things are going right for me at this point. So I played c4, just looking to push forward, and he played f5, which attacks the queen, but now the queen just finds another good diagonal on this diagonal opposite the black king. And after queen to g7, looking to trade queens, I just played f4. And of course now he doesn't want to trade because I would have these super strong pawns here. This guy is very close. He's going to have to bring his rook here, and I'm just going to push these pawns forward and be much better. So he played rook to d8, getting in front of my pawn. And now again, I'm trying to push forward, looking to open up the position and go into a winning endgame. And he played king to f7, and now king to b3, getting out of this pin. And at this point, the path to victory is pretty straightforward for an advanced player, but unfortunately, as a result of me wasting 7 minutes earlier on in the game, I only have about 40 seconds at this point. Now, I kind of psyched myself out here because I was thinking if I took the queen, it would be bad for me because his king is dangerously close to picking off my pawn. But really, I underestimated how fast my own king was, and as it turns out, after a move like king to b5, and pawn takes, king here, I come in with my king, and now my king is extremely active. This is completely winning for me now. My king is either going to harass his rook and allow me to promote this pawn, or it's going to come here and maybe win some of these pawns. Either way, it's going to be not too difficult to win here. Instead, I played a little bit of a risky move. Pawn takes pawn, and after pawn takes, again, I could have traded the queens off, but I took here. And although I'm winning a pawn, my king is now severely exposed, and he plays rook to b8 check. And already I have to be extremely careful here. With a move like queen to a2, I simply get checkmated. But the move I was counting on here was king to a4, because although the king is open from this side, there's no way to directly get at him. So I was thinking that I'm safe, I'm just going to push this pawn to victory, and I'm going to seal up this win. So my opponent played queen to b2, and I saw that there was no checkmate here because the king has this pawn, my queen is pretty well placed to guard everything, so I just played d7. But as it turns out, this is a colossal blunder because the move that I forgot was queen to b3. And although it doesn't lead to a checkmate, as I realized, it is a fork. And this means that I'm now losing my rook. And for king to a5, queen takes b3, and suddenly my rook, which is well placed to support the pawn, is now gone, and I'm in a lot of trouble. Just to take it back a few moves, if I had just played rook to d3 here, I would have been completely fine because now with a fork against the rook, he will take my rook, but I will now take this pawn and create my own fork and pick up his rook. And after a move like king to f8, I will take his rook, and I'm completely winning now. All I have to do is get the queen into position and push this pawn, and it's going to be completely winning. But a little bit of a lapse of concentration, and all of a sudden now I'm down a rook and my king is in the wilderness waiting to get checkmated. And I tried queen to c7 looking to attack the rook and threaten to promote, but unfortunately my king is just way too open. My opponent just maneuvers his queen in, and finally we have a checkmate. So yeah, an unfortunate end to a game that I played pretty well throughout, but the fact that I spent 7 minutes on move 8 really took the toll on me because I had a lot less time than my opponent throughout the rest of the game. And had I had a few more minutes to think, I probably would have seen rook to d3, and I would have been fine. So the negative of this game is that I blew it and lost, but the positive is it really forced me to reevaluate the way that I play these rapid games. In the past, I've spent a lot of time on certain key moves, which is okay, but you simply can't afford to spend 4, 5, 6, even 7 minutes on a move in a game where you only have 15. So I really need to work on my time management in order to continue progressing towards that ultimate rapid goal.